In this video, I'm going to explain how to do the bank account reconciliation process that's described in this guide here. So in order to perform this task, you're going to be doing everything using a Google Sheet. And the whole goal of reconciliation is to match information that's in two different Google Sheets. One of them represents a real bank account, which I'm going to call the statement ledger. And then another one is using a personal finance software called HomeBudget. So I'll call that the HomeBudget ledger. I may also refer to the statement ledger as the reference ledger. So um, this guide contains all the information that you'll need in order to do the reconciliation process. And so in this video, I'm going to be going through all of the content that's in this guide and giving an example of and walking through the actual steps of the process. So first, I'm going to describe the sheet itself and each of the tabs that are in the sheets. So there's a total of 8, but you'll just be using 3 of them, and then I'll get into and describe essentially how you know you're complete with the process, and that's when the reconciliation gap goes to 0. And then I'll go in and then I'll kind of walk through what an example of one reconciliation for one account. So there are a total of 4 accounts that are going to be reconciled, and they're labeled here. TWH City, TWH DBS Multi SGD, TWH DBS Visa, and TWH Visa USD. And the sheets are color coded. So there's blue means that it's interactive, yellow means that it's manual input, and then purple means it's reference. And the main tab that you're going to be interfacing with is the reconcile tab. So to access the sheet, you can follow this link here, reconcile Google Sheet, which I have already opened up on my computer in this tab here. So this is what it looks like. And you should not be able to type anywhere except for the areas indicated, highlighted in yellow. And you should see the other 2 sheets over here, which is the ledger, STM ledger sheet, which you should not be able to type anywhere at any point in it. And finally the edits, which you will have, that's where you'll be able to actually manually enter into and edit, because that's going to be your main output and the main output from this whole process, the product of this whole process. And so when you make changes and you add transactions into edit, then you will notice that they will appear over here and display on the reconcile sheet. In this top banner here, you can see that there's the basic account information, which is here's the account, and there's total of the 4 accounts, so you can select. There's an extra account here, common UOB. You can ignore that. You also have the beginning balance as well as the ending balance and the reconcile gap, and you can select the year and month. Below, you can see here, this is the ledger. So if you're familiar with accounting process, so a ledger is an ordered list of transactions for a single account, and so you'll have a date field, you'll have an amount field, and then you'll have kind of a description field, which is here, it's notes. Then you can have like lots of other fields. So don't worry too much about these other fields, but just take note that they need to match between the ledger, and when you create a new edit, that they should have the same fields. So they can, when we get into reconciliation, then you can use these other fields as clues when you're matching transactions. So, and also for a single account, well, okay. I'm okay. Forget that. Never mind. Another field in a typical account ledger is the balance, and this is what's called a cumulative sum um, of all the transactions. So if you notice, the difference between these two balances here is equal to this transaction here, 3621, and similar, the difference between these two transactions here is 500. So the balance is the cumulative sum of all these transactions plus the beginning balance. So that's what the balance field is. So you're going to use the balance field to help you through the reconciliation process when you go transaction by when you're matching transactions. Because the ultimate goal here is so that the ending balance here is the ending balance over here, and that's the difference that we see in the reconcile gap. So each transaction is either a withdrawal with a negative or it's a deposit with a positive. So withdrawals and deposits don't necessarily correspond to transaction type, so don't assume that they're the same. Just follow whether it's a negative or a positive. Now moving on to the edits. So you will find that it's more helpful to have the edits open in a separate window, which I've already done. So, and I'm going to put them on a dual display so you can see their interaction side by side.
Okay, so let's go through an example. So I've got a few tabs open, and you'll find this goes a lot easier when you do have the multiple tabs open like this. So I've got the reconcile open here on my left, and I've got the reference ledger over here, and then down at the bottom I have the edits. And we're going to be using all three of them. So first thing is to verify that you have a stable internet connection and there aren't any really obvious error messages. And then what you're going to do is you're going to, over to the reconcile sheet, you're going to select the month for the reconcile month, and you're going to select the account. And this process occurs account by account. So there's a total of 4. We will not be using the common UOB. So in this example, I'm going to use the DBS multi-SGD. So a little bit about how to select the month. Typically, this occurs once a month, and by the time that you end up actually doing the reconciliation, it could be in the same month as the reconcile month, but typically it's going to be maybe in the first or second week of the next month. So if the current month, let's say you're doing it in September, now it's 6th of September. Typically, your reconcile month is the prior month from the current month. So in this case, it's August. Now, but when you start, and okay, I don't mean to use the same word again here for confusion, but when you start, you're typically going to start with 1 month before the reconcile month. So in this case, that's July. So I'm going to call that the prior month. And the reconcile month is August. So you change that by changing it here in the reconcile sheet over here in the month field highlighted in yellow, and it will automatically update on the reference. So you don't need to touch the reference. So if we do that for the TWH DBS multi-SG, then we can see that it's already, the reconcile gap is already closed. We don't need to do anything further to reconcile this. So we can go ahead and move on to the next month, which is the reconcile month, which is August. And we can see that there is a gap, so we have some work to do. Once we've finished for the reconcile month, we're done for that account, and we can move on to the next account. Now, the goal of reconciliation is to close this reconciliation gap. And the way that we end up doing that is by over here in the edits screen by adding edits, which come in two different forms: additions and removals of transactions. And so and that's all with reference to the reconcile ledger. So we either add new transactions to the reconcile ledger or we remove them. And if you think about it, one very simple way of reconciling this is simply to, because remember, we're trying to match this with the reference. We could just simply remove all of the transactions from the reconcile ledger, and then we can add all the transactions from the reference ledger, and then we're done, right? Well, that is not what we want to do. And the reason for that is because that defeats the value of having these classified and categorized transactions in the reconcile or HomeBudget app. So the difference between these two ledgers is that this is in a personal finance software app, HomeBudget, which has categories. And that's not present in the raw transactions from the statements. And that's the purpose of having two accounts rather than just one. So we want to try to preserve as much of that information as we can, so we're not duplicating that effort later on in the next step. Because every edit that we make, we need to go and classify the transaction manually again later. So we don't want to create more work. So if we want to try to minimize how many edits that we make, we just want to edit just as much as necessary to close the reconcile gap and no more. So another related goal to closing the gap, but yet minimizing the number of edits, is to match transactions. So reconciliation can be rephrased as a transaction matching, and it applies some human judgment and human interpretation. And that's because some of these descriptions in the raw transactions are quite cryptic, and figuring out how to match them to the rather sparse descriptions and clues that you get from the HomeBudget reconcile transaction ledger is where there's a bit of a trick to it. Now, there's a few tips that I provide in the guide for this. In general, to not overdo it and be quite generous with your matching. So if the values match and the dates are within 7 days of one another, you can go ahead and just consider it a match, unless there's some compelling, obvious reason why you think probably it should not be a match. But these two rules is your first heuristic. You're going to be going through a lot of transactions, so it's best not to overthink it. Okay, the second thing is that there's split transactions. So if you look at one example, so a split transaction is where there is one transaction that occurs in the reference that corresponds to multiple transactions in the budget, in the reconcile ledger. So I'm showing you an example here where there's one transaction for 300 that has a comment top up deposit. And then over here on the reconcile, you can see there's two transactions that say deposit top up. Okay, it's not exactly the same, but it's quite close. And they both add up to the same amount. So that's an example of a split transaction. So that's considered a match, which means we're not going to apply any edits for this. Another kind of edit to watch out for is when you have in the reconcile or HomeBudget app, when you have two transactions that add up together and net off one another. So the overall result here is 0. And so some judgments to apply there is when you can see some kind of similar description, and they're also usually should be on the same day or within 1 to 3 days of one another. And yeah, one of them will be positive and the others will be negative, such that they net off. So when you see net offs like that, then you do not need to apply any edits because they do not contribute at all to the reconciliation gap. So that's that's the same principle that applies both to the split transaction as well as the net offs, is they do not ultimately contribute to the gap. So you can ignore them. They can be considered as a match. Finally, the third tip is if you find, and I don't have any examples here, but if you find that the transaction differs just only by the amount, but everything else appears to match, which that may be very hard for you to figure out, but in some cases where the description is very clearly, obviously the same thing, and it's maybe just differing by a penny or something like that, then basically you would still treat it the same way you would anyways, by removing one transaction and then adding the other, as though you didn't know it was just the amount. So you still proceed the same, but just in the notes section, just make a note, you know, in addition to the actual transaction itself, that, you know, it's a amount change, you know, and then colon, then proceed with the rest of the notes after that, just to alert to the end user that they only need to update the amount, that you do think that those two transactions are related. So finally, when you are finished, then what you're going to do is you're going to sort them, the output, first by edit with the adds at the top and removes at the bottom, and then by the account, and then finally date descending. So let's go through and let's reconcile this account here as an example. So we start at the top and then we go down and we just start matching transactions. And when we find that we cannot match a transaction, then we add it to the edit until we get all the way through and the reconcile got closed. So let's get started. So right off the bat, I'm not able to find this 1530 anywhere in here. So it's pretty clearly, that's going to be a, we're going to add that. So I'm adding it one by one here. And they are not necessarily in the same order. So you do need to do one column at a time. You need to find the matching fields. And we have rent. I'm just going to type it in. And this is TWH, DBS, multi SGD. This is SGD. The currency amount is minus 1530. And if we look over here now, that transaction now shows up here. We need to put remove. That transaction shows over here now is removed. And you can see the balance is also updated, and we see the reconcile gap is all smaller. Okay, now let's go a little bit more quickly in matching transactions. So the next transaction here, 500, indeed, it matches over here with 500. The next one down the way is 163.54. Indeed, we find another one, 163.54. Continuing on, we find 3621, 3621, 11093, 11093, 40, 40, 2570, 2570, 300. And remember the split transaction, which we identified earlier, 7666, 7666, 80, 80, 1283, 1283. Remember the net off, 2457, 2457, 60.1, 60.1. Okay, so now we're left with these transactions. Okay, hopefully you'll be able to recognize that there's another split transaction here because these two transactions add up to 1050. Okay, so we're left with the original 1530 that we just found, plus all these other transactions here from basically everything after the 23rd of August. So let's go ahead and add those in. And we're going to remove them as well. Okay, and now we can see that we've closed the reconcile. So we're done for this account, which means that we can then move on to the next account. So once we're finished, then, as I said, this edit sheet is going to be our output. So we will order it first by edit with all the adds at the top and all the removes at the bottom, then by account here, and then by date descending. And then once we're finished, then you send an email to the email that's listed in the guide with the subject as account reconcile year and then month complete. And that's it.